Any sophisticated adventurer knows that when one is adventuring in the winter months, one must always have ready access to a cup of tea. I got on the steampunk bandwagon well over 10 years ago, so I've seen teacup holsters making the rounds of the internet for quite some time. My favorite geekery Facebook group, Pinterest, and then Rachel Maxey did a video a little while back. Now, these are most commonly made out of leather, but then I found a pattern on Etsy that is fabric-based, so I decided to turn this into an effort to use up some of the copious amounts of scrap fabric I now have floating around. And in fact, thanks to raiding my mum's craft stash for a snap, I managed to make this project entirely out of materials I already had on hand. I did vary from the directions a little bit, since again my goal was to not buy any new materials, and again I don't usually have much in the way on hand of anything relating to fusible fleece, whatever that even is, and so I had to get creative in a couple of parts. So let's dive right in, shall we? With all the pattern pieces cut out, I raided my cabbage stash. In place of fusible interfacing, I used a bit of canvas, and for the lining I used some little scrappy bits of silk from my waistcoat. For the main fabric, I used this super cool teal fabric of unknown fiber content. I picked this up at the thrift store last year and made most of it into a rockin' walking skirt. The beauty of this being a little bitty project is that all those tiny bits of fabric that are just too small for much else are finally getting used up. There was a brief moment where I wondered if I would have enough silk for the lining, but as it turned out, there was exactly just enough. The pattern also calls for a fusible fleece. I don't have that, and I wasn't about to run out and try to locate some when this was literally all I needed, so I pulled out some cabbage from my recent hooded cowl project instead and basted it in place. First up was joining the spoon loops and the main strap. The spoon loops just get sewn together, but the strap needs a bit more strength, so I flatlined it with canvas. A quick basting around of the holster loops, and then they get sewn right sides together along the long side. Everything gets flipped right side out, which was definitely easier for one of these more than the other. Then they get pressed so the seam lies at the center back. And I did the same thing with the holster loops, and since these are such small pieces, I didn't worry about basting the layers together this time. The loops get turned right side out, given a good pressing, and they're ready to go. It's time to move on to the body of the holster. First up is the back pocket, which has the main fabric and lining stitched together, right sides facing. It gets flipped right side out and pressed nice and smooth, and then top stitched to hold everything in place. The back pocket then gets pinned to the back piece of the holster and stitched down on 3 sides. Turning to the front pocket, I am just using regular fleece instead of fusible, but a good firm iron never hurts. I did a line of basting all the way around, and then added the lining fabric, stitching just along the top line. This gets pressed open, folded over, and pressed down to enclose the raw edges. And top stitched along the top line. I attached a layer of fleece to the front of the holster base in the same way, and then attached the front pocket, making sure everything was even. And then we stitch around the pocket. This pattern uses a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which I have to say is probably the narrowest seam allowance I've worked with yet, but I made it work. The pocket for the teacup has 2 tiny darts on both the main fabric and lining, which were rather fiddly to put in, but they did give a nice curve to the pocket. The teacup pocket also gets fleece lining for padding, which again I basted around. Then I matched up the lining to the main fabric and pinned them together only on the short straight corners and the upper curve. Then it gets stitched along the upper edge, clipped to reduce bulk, and flipped right sides out, pressing as I went. A quick row of top stitching made sure that the lining wouldn't shift around and peek out behind the main fabric, and a quick basting line along the bottom held everything in place. Then I added the strap to the teacup pocket, pinning it down wrong side up, folding it over itself to hide the raw edge, and then finishing it by hand since at this point it was a little too bulky for my machine. The strap closes by a heavy-duty snap, and I had never tried doing this before. Basically, you poke a hole, join the 2 halves of the front piece thingy, and gently shamash with a hammer, and then repeat with the back half. And if you're very lucky, and not like me, you'll do it right the first time and not have to carefully pull out a smashed backing without tearing the fabric and try again. Okay, time for final assembly. Not gonna lie, the instructions threw me off at first, but I did figure it out in the end. So, first the teacup pocket gets attached, and I would recommend quilt clips over pins for this. It's so much easier to adjust this way. Then the spoon loops are added, and I ended up folding the width in half because, as sewn according to the pattern, they looked really chunky. But half the width is perfect. Holster straps get added, raw edges facing up, and here's where I was initially weirded out. The back half gets attached, right sides together, and the whole thing is sewn around except for a small gap at the top. Then the whole thing ends up getting flipped right side out, which is easier said than done, I gotta say. I probably should have left this gap a bit bigger, as flipping this sucker took for absolutely ever. Once right side out, I closed up the gap by hand. I tried doing a bit of hand top stitching, but got partway along and decided I didn't like it, so I pulled it all out. At this point, it was done, except I thought the snap looked a little plain. It clearly needed an extra layer of pizzazz. So I grabbed some of my favorite nail polish and threw on a couple layers for some sparkle. Now she's done and ready for some winter tea time adventures. I could definitely see this working as a good gift for fellow steampunk/tea-loving friends. It's relatively easy to put together, and while not super practical, it is fun. I love that it's got extra pockets for sugar, tea bags, a biscuit or two, whatever you like, and it's kind of a hoot taking a fancy teacup on a winter walk.